Hello and welcome to our first webinar on supporting participation and inclusion. My name's Anthea and I'll be your trainer over this next series of 3 webinars. In this session we will discuss determining the requirements of an individual plan, establishing a relationship with the client within their home, operating respectfully within the client's home, and completing reports and documentation. In this webinar, we're going to focus on home and community care, which is also known as HACC. So let's first of all have a little look at what HACC is. The Home and Community Care Program provides services for frail older people, younger people with disabilities and also their carers. The program funds around 470 agencies to support nearly 300,000 people. HACC services provide basic support and maintenance to people living at home to help avoid premature or inappropriate admission into long-term residential facilities. The Australian and also Victorian governments jointly fund the HACC program. Local governments also make significant contributions. Fees are paid by people who use the HACC services, as that's a way of them contributing to the resources they require for their program. Now we've had a quick introduction into home and community care, let's look at determining the requirements of an individual plan when working in HACC. When you start working with a new client in their home, you will first of all need to locate, read and interpret their individual plan. The individual plan outlines what the client's needs are, what part you will play in providing these needs, and what methods you will use to provide them. It will also outline the types of equipment and also the aids a client uses. For an older person or a person with a disability, everyday tasks such as opening a jar, drying their feet, putting their socks on, or performing cleaning tasks may become increasingly challenging. The reduced ability to undertake domestic and household tasks, maintain their personal care, or prepare food is often a catalyst for referral to a home and community care service. Promoting the use of easy living equipment is about assisting people to overcome challenges and maintain their independence to the greatest extent possible. And in some cases, it may reduce the need for the client to access HACC services. Prior to you arriving at your client's home for the first time, you will need to confirm the following: the time of your expected arrival. Please ensure that you're on time. Clients can become anxious upon late arrivals. The address at which you are to provide services. Always make sure you know the correct address and make sure that you look professional by turning up to the correct place at the correct time. You need to make sure that you have the required equipment on hand, because you will not be able to complete your job if you don't have the equipment with you. And that you've read the required documentation. It's important to have this on hand. If you do not have it or you're relying on your memory, you may get confused to what you actually are required to do. The final thing you need is to make sure that you've got the resources required and available to do your job. Always make sure you're prepared when you arrive. This gives your clients a sense of confidence in your ability to perform your tasks. Clients can become distressed and feel you're incompetent, which reflects badly on your organisation. If you're running late, it's important to make sure that your client knows this so they don't become worried or stressed to your whereabouts. When commencing work with a client, there will always be the first time you enter their home. To assure them that you are who you say you are, you should follow your organisation's policies and procedures for entering their home. In most cases, you'll be provided with an identification tag that can be shown to your client upon your arrival. It will have your name and the name of the organisation that you work for on it, alongside a photo of yourself. Generally, this is enough to reassure your client who you are and they feel safe to allow you to enter their home. The first time you meet a client, it's very important that you use effective communication skills. Effective communication helps us better understand a person or the situation they're in and enables us to resolve differences, build trust and respect, and create environments where creative ideas, problem solving, affection and caring can flourish. While effective communication is a learned skill, is more effective when it's done in a spontaneous manner. Effective communication includes active listening. This is a communication technique which requires the listener to feed back what they hear the speaker say by paraphrasing what they've heard in their own words, to confirm what they've heard and moreover to confirm the understanding from both parties. It also includes appropriate communication aids. A communication aid helps a person to communicate more effectively with those around them. These aids can range from simple letterboards to sophisticated computer equipment. Effective communication can also include appropriate modes of communication. There are 4 main types of communication. These include dialogue or verbal communication, non-verbal communication, visual communication, and other types of communication. Effective communication also includes appropriate tone and presentation. This can be communicated through gestures, body language, posture, facial expression, and eye contact. Finally, effective communication includes observation and also about providing accurate information. The ability to communicate information accurately and clearly and as attended as it should be. The way you interact with your new client will determine how your client perceives you, so please remain professional at all times. Whilst you're at your client's house, allow them time to express any concerns that they have. There'll be times when your client feels a little unsettled about something. You should always consider their perspective in relation to the visits and how they are feeling. There are many ways of doing this, and the most basic way to do this is to ask them. They may feel comfortable enough to converse with you about how they're feeling, and you may be able to get some honest feedback. But probably the best way to provide them with feedback or to gather feedback is by using a feedback form. They can either pass it back to you directly, or if they feel more comfortable, they can put it in their post. It'll be necessary to collect feedback from our clients on a regular basis as part of the organisational policies and procedures. This information will then be used to revise and improve service delivery arrangements that we are providing to our clients. Feedback from clients can be collected using a series of different methods, including discussions, focus groups, surveys, direct questioning, review of documentation, and feedback reports. There are a number of benefits of working within the community. One of these benefits is that you get to meet people from a wide range of culture, origins, and backgrounds. It's important that no matter what the background of the individual that you are working with or working for, that you show them respect that you would want to be shown yourself. Whilst working with clients in home and community care, it's important to remember that every client has the right to their privacy and dignity. This includes demonstrating the utmost respect for the client, their belongings, and their information. All organisations will have strict policies on privacy and dignity, and these must be followed at all times. You need to remember that you are in the client's home and that they deserve to be treated fairly and with respect and dignity. When working in HAC, you may encounter situations that present workplace hazards. These hazards have the potential to cause a risk of harm to yourself, your co-workers, and your clients. You will need to be alert to the presence of these hazards in order to maintain the health and safety of all the people that you work with. The aspects of hazard identification process in a workplace include observing changes in the environment, the behaviour of the staff and clients, and the equipment that you're working with. When a hazard is identified, it's the responsibility of the worker to eliminate or at least reduce the hazard within the scope of their role, and then to notify the appropriate personnel. A hazard may be defined as anything, including work practices or procedures, that has the potential to cause harm to the health or safety of a person. Hazards can be grouped into 5 broad categories. These include physical hazards such as noise and light, chemical hazards such as poison and dust, biological hazards such as viruses and plants, mechanical or electrical hazards such as slips or trips, and psychological hazards such as fatigue or bullying. Now look at some examples of workplace hazards. This can include the work environment, for example the floor surface, heat, for example burns and scalds, electricity, for example electrocution, harassment, for example bullying, hazardous substances like chemicals and fumes, biological waste, skin penetrating injuries such as needle stick injuries, and manual handling hazards such as pushing and pulling objects. It's important then when working in a home and community care environment that you're aware of basic home fire safety and legislation around smoke alarms. The Department of Social Services has released an industry feedback alert for home care services on basic fire safety. This includes that during the initial assessment with the client needs to be advised that they need to have a working smoke alarm. Also, when care is provided and there is no smoke alarm, the installation of a smoke alarm needs to be organised within line with the service provision. You are to promote regular testing and maintenance of the smoke alarms. And in homes where care recipients smoke, you need to promote the use of high-sided ashtrays or sealed containers. Fire safety training materials also need to be included for staff in the induction process. And where the client is considered to be at a greater risk due to their health or lifestyle factors, additional smoke alarms should be installed within their home. When working in home and community care, you will frequently be in contact with clients that have a variety of different behavioural patterns, as well as having to be aware of any environmental hazards that may present within the workplace. You also need to look out for your own personal safety when interacting with other people. Home and community care workers are particularly at risk of injury and harm from the behaviour of their clients because they work with clients that are often in a high-risk client group, and a lot of their work is carried out in a less predictable environment, for example, in a client's home. Clients can become aggressive in some situations and violent at times. Some factors that may contribute to workplace environment can include poor management of mental illness, neurological disorders or brain injuries, confusion, disorientation or dementia, drug and alcohol use or withdrawal, or a client feeling powerless or ignored. Some violent acts may include verbal abuse. This can happen face-to-face or over the telephone, written abuse, bullying and harassment, spitting, stalking, threats, ganging up, bullying, intimidation, physical or sexual assault, malicious damage to the property of staff, clients and or the organisation. All acts of violence should be reported to your supervisor as soon as possible. While control measures may reduce the potential for violence, it can still occur. So being prepared for a violent incident can reduce the effects of the violence, particularly the long-term effects of trauma that can result. Developing procedures to reduce the number and severity of violent incidents can help make the workplace safer and a healthier place for employers, employees and visitors. Therefore, it's always important to follow your organisation's policies and procedures. We're now going to talk about working respectfully in a client's home. Working in someone's home is very different to them coming into your place of work. People's private lives are there for you to see. Some people cope well with the invasion of their personal space, and others not so well. When you're working in their home, you need to show respect for the way they live and make no judgments. When I was working in HAC, I witnessed all sorts of different living conditions, and I would make sure that I always showed the client the respect they deserved and didn't judge them for the way or the environment in which they lived. It's obvious that when working in home and community care, that we owe a duty of care to our clients. Clients rely on their staff to ensure that they're properly cared for. It's not just the clients to whom this duty is owed, but also their families. Families expect that staff will use their expertise to care for their family member appropriately. When a resident or client moves into a residential or a community care service, the intended care to be given is known and agreed to. The law expects that the agreed care will be delivered with the required skills and at a level of competence equal to the needs of that individual client. As a member of staff who is employed to support the older people or older person, your responsibilities and duty of care to the client are that you must do everything reasonable that you can to ensure that there are as few as possible infringements of any resident or client's rights. The key word in this sentence is reasonable. You must do everything reasonable. Where a duty of care is not exercised and harm comes to the client or resident, then the resident or client may bring a charge of negligence against the employee and the employer. The resident or client may seek compensation for any loss of quality of life that results. Where the intent has been malicious, a charge under criminal law may be required and to be answered in court. It's important for workers in home and community care roles to have a clear understanding of what their duty of care and other legal responsibilities are. It's of equal importance that they fulfil these responsibilities while practicing their professions and fulfilling their work roles. Upon accepting any home and community care role within Australia, one must accept the responsibility for upholding their duties of care and all other relevant legislation that applies to this individual's work role. It's of monumental importance that each worker understands that he or she is personally accountable for his or her own actions in relation to their role. Duty of care is one legal obligation to take reasonable care to prevent others from being harmed. This means that if a worker identifies something that could reasonably be considered to be a risk, then the employer must, in response, take reasonable action to eliminate that risk. The legal responsibilities and obligations of a role within the realm of the community services include international, federal, and local legislation, which are required to be followed by law by all employees that are in that role. It's important that you discuss any difficulties with your legal and ethical responsibilities with your supervisor. Also, if you're unsure of what your responsibilities are, ask your supervisor about this as well. Let's now look at confidentiality. Confidentiality is the protection of personal information. Confidentiality refers to the obligation to keep confidential information that is entrusted and keep it with secret. This obligation is recognised under the Privacy Act 1988. Exercising confidentiality involves client information between the client and the relevant persons providing care and service to that client. It is the responsibility of all people working within the community service sector to ensure that confidentiality is maintained at all times. So let's look at some examples of maintaining confidentiality. Not sharing client information with others that are not working with the client. Ensuring that client details are stored when they cannot be accessed by unauthorised people. For example, they need to be stored in a locked cupboard. Making sure that information disclosed is done so with the expressed permission of the client. Not sharing medical details without consent. Not sharing financial details without consent. Can you think of 4 examples of what a piece of confidential information might be? Let's now have a look at some common examples. Personal details, such as name and address. Family or next of kin details. Bank details. Medical records or medical results. A client's care plan. A client's progress notes. An individualised plan. Incident reports. Legal information. And letters or other correspondence. Maintaining confidentiality is important for a number of different reasons. One of the critical aspects of confidentiality is that it allows for a bond of trust to be established between the client, the worker, and the organisation as a whole. Once this trust is established, the client is more likely to freely share information, which will benefit the client and also the worker when providing care to their client. When gathering information from the client, it's ideally done directly without the client. If there is a necessity to gather information from other sources, for example, family members or other agencies, then this should be done with consent of the client. The client should never feel that information is being collected from behind their back. Privacy is essential in order to maintain confidentiality. When discussing personal matters with a client, it should be done in an environment which is quiet and discreet. Discussion about client matters should only take place in the workplace and should never be audible when out in general public. For example, if you're out having dinner with work colleagues on a Friday night, it's important that you do not talk about your clients in that public area. Or if you are talking about your clients, you talk about them in a manner where the client cannot be identified, so you don't use their names, or you don't describe them in a way that somebody sitting on the table next to you can identify who the client is. The client's details should never be discussed with anyone without their consent. And it's essential that all staff respect the confidentiality of clients at all times. As a leisure and health worker, documentation must be kept private and safe. This also means not speaking about a client if other people are present, so avoid talking about clients in public places, like we said just then, if you're out for dinner, or in a car park, or at a shopping centre. Before discussing information with a client's family member, you should first ask the client and/or your supervisor which family members should be consulted and what information can be discussed. Note that a family member may have power of attorney, which means that they've been legally permitted to make decisions or act on behalf of a client, if the client has been deemed not competent to make their own decisions. A family member may also be a client's parent or a guardian, depending on the situation, the age of the client, the ability of the client. The parent or guardian may be responsible for providing and accessing personal information about the client. So it's very important that you find out from your supervisor before providing or giving out any information to any family members. Confidentiality must be maintained at all times and must be in accordance with policies and procedures with the organisation in which you are employed. If you have any concerns regarding the interpretation of these policies, then it's always advisable that you consult your manager or your supervisor as soon as possible. We are now going to talk about different forms of abuse. When working with clients, it's important that staff are able to recognise signs consistent with financial, physical or emotional abuse or neglect of the client and report these to the appropriate person as soon as possible. There are several different types or categories of abuse. Abuse could be observed. Staff member in residential or home and community care services may observe incidents of abuse towards a client. There can be reported abuse. This may be directly reported to a member of staff by the victim or by another client who observed the incident. And then there's suspected abuse. A worker or another person may detect unusual behaviours or events that could indicate a client is being abused. We're now going to look at the different types of abuse. The first one is domestic violence. Violence, abuse and intimidation perpetrated by one person against another in a personal, intimate relationship. It is partnership violence that includes violence perpetrated when couples are separated or divorced. Domestic violence occurs between two people where one has the power over the other, causing them fear, physical or psychological harm. The next type of abuse we're going to look at is neglect. Neglect is a failure to provide the basic physical and emotional necessities of life. It can be willfully denying medication, medical or dental care, therapeutic devices or other physical assistance to a person who requires it because of their age, health or disability. It can also include a failure to provide adequate shelter, clothing, food, protection and supervision, or to place a person at undue risk through unsafe environment or practices, thereby exposing that person to a risk of physical, mental, or emotional harm. Neglect includes the failure to provide the reassurance or stimulation needed for the social, intellectual, and emotional growth or well-being of an adult or also a child. The next type of abuse we're going to look at is physical abuse. Physical abuse is assault, non-accidental injury or physical harm to a person by another person. It includes, but is not limited to, inflicting pain or any unpleasant sensation, causing harm or injuries by excessive discipline, beating, shaking, bruising, electric shock, laceration or welts, burns, fractures, dislocation, and attempted suffocation and strangulation. Examples of physical abuse can include hitting, smacking, biting or kicking, bending back fingers or arms, dragging, carrying or pushing people who do not want to be moved. Involuntary relocation is a part of this. Physical restraint, threat and violence. The form of abuse we're going to look at is sexual abuse. This is any sexual contact between an adult and child 16 years of age and younger, or any sexual activity with an adult who lacks the capacity to give or withhold consent, or is threatened, coerced, or forced into engaging in sexual behaviour. It includes non-consensual sexual contact, language, and it can take in the form of rape, indecent assault, sexual harassment, and sexual interference in any form. The next form of abuse we're going to look at is emotional abuse. This can include verbal assaults, threats of maltreatment, harassment, humiliation, or intimidation. It also includes the failure to interact with a person or to acknowledge that person's existence. This may also include denying cultural or religious needs and preferences of a client. Some examples of emotional and psychological abuse can include humiliating a client for losing control of their bladder or bowels, treating clients in a way that deny them their dignity, preventing clients from expressing themselves without fear of retaliation, discouraging personalisation of rooms or clothing, limiting social freedom available to the clients, shouting orders to clients, and using humiliating names when speaking to a client. The final type of abuse we're going to talk about is financial abuse. This is improper use of another person's assets or the use or withholding of another person's resources. Some examples of financial abuse include denying clients access to or control over their money when they have a demonstrated capacity to manage their own finances, denying a client access to information about their personal finances, taking a client's money or property without their consent, forced changes to wills or other legal documents, and using a client's belongings for your own personal use. Staff and management play an important role in protecting clients from further harm by recognising the indicators of abuse and responding to them. The presence of one or more indicators does not mean that the abuse has occurred, but does require the staff to look into this further and act on the client's behalf. Let's now look at some indicators that may show that the client is experiencing abuse. For physical abuse, it could include things such as facial, head or neck bruising or injuries, drowsiness, vomiting or fits, unexplained or poorly explained injuries, bruising and marks that may suggest the shape of the object that it's caused it. For example, if a client got hit by something, the bruising might be the shape of that object. Bite marks or scratches, unexplained burns or scalds, unexplained fractures or dislocations. Some of the behavioural signs of physical abuse can be explanation inconsistent with an injury, avoidance or fearfulness of a particular person or staff member, sleep disturbances, and changes in behaviour, for example, withdrawal. Let's now look at neglect and some of the physical indicators. This can include hunger and weight loss, poor hygiene or poor hair quality or texture, inappropriate or inadequate clothing for the weather, inappropriate or inadequate shelter, unattended physical problems or medical needs, health or dietary practices that endanger the health or development of the individual, and social isolation. Some behavioural signs you'll be looking out for when it comes to neglect includes a client requesting, begging, scavenging or stealing food, constant fatigue or falling asleep, direct or indirect disclosure of the neglect, extreme longing for company, anxiety about being alone or abandoned, displaying inappropriate or excessive self-comforting behaviours. We're now going to look at the physical indicators for sexual abuse. It could be that a client has actually described to you the sexual act that occurred, trauma to the client's breasts, buttocks, lower abdo or thighs, difficulty walking or sitting, injuries, pain or itching to the genital, anus or perineal area, torn, stained or blood-stained underwear or clothes, sexually transmitted diseases, unexplained accumulation of gifts, and unexplained pregnancy. Some behavioural signs that sexual abuse is occurring can be the repeat use of words such as bad or dirty, self-destructive behaviours, sudden changes in behaviour, for example, depression or withdrawal, inappropriate advances to others, sleep disturbances, refusing to go to bed or going to bed fully clothed, eating disorders, refusing to shower or, the other extreme, constant showering, and refusing to attend the usual places they go to, for example, respite. We can now look at the physical indicators for psychological or emotional abuse. This can include things such as speech disorders, weight loss or gain. Some behavioural signs of emotional abuse are feelings of worthlessness about life and self, including low self-esteem, extreme attention-seeking behaviours, for example, aggression, and other behavioural signs such as depression, withdrawal and crying. The final type of abuse we're going to look at for physical indicators is financial abuse. This includes restricted access to or no control over their personal funds and bank account, and no records or incomplete records kept of expenditure and purchases. Some behavioural signs that a client is experiencing financial abuse can be they're stealing from others, they're borrowing money, or they're begging. All suspected witnessed abuse must be reported to your supervisor as soon as possible, and the abuse policy and procedure must be followed. There is a 24-hour timeframe in which all suspected and alleged elder abuse needs to be reported to both the police and department. So it's vital that any suspected or witnessed abuse is reported to your supervisor as soon as possible. We are now going to talk about reporting and documentation. While you're working in a client's home, it will be part of your role to monitor and observe them for changes in both behaviour and the environment. This also includes their health status. You may be the only person that sees that client on a daily or weekly basis, so you should ensure that you observe and report any changes in their behaviour, health status and environment. Your organisation will have its own policies and procedures on reporting these matters. The report could be done via the telephone, face-to-face, written in the progress notes or case notes. What you need to report are things such as any changes in the client, when do you need to report, when any changes in a client's condition occur, or when a condition does not change, obvious signs of deterioration, changes in a client's routine, when requested by the client and as per the organisational policies and procedures. You will need to report to senior management, colleagues and allied health professionals as required. Expected to complete a variety of documentation over your working life. This documentation must be presented in a format that's acceptable to your organisation and in line with the legislation, regulations and policies and procedures. The features of a good written report include that it's objective, relevant accurate, complete, concise, specific, clear, logical, useful, and non-judgmental. You should never make subjective statements when writing reports. Statements such as, Brian was in a picky mood today. State only your observations. What did you see? What did you hear? A statement such as Brian was unhappy with something, and state each thing he was unhappy with, or if he made a specific comment. Always make sure you do not make any judgments and you only write down the facts. The final topic in this session is DVA. Do you know what is meant by DVA? DVA stands for the Department of Veteran Affairs. The Department of Veteran Affairs provides support to current and former serving members and their families through a range of benefits, including ongoing or one-off payments. For example, support may be available for clients in the case of injury, disease or death, permanent impairment, incapacity for work service, needing ongoing household or attendant care, needing treatment such as healthcare, and the loss or damage to medical aids. DVA can assist with these kinds of things through funding equipment and funding services that some clients may require. Thank you for your participation today in this webinar. Continue now by watching this video on HAC and home and community care packages.